All right, I'm going to go ahead and just start with some introductions and some logistical things while we're having people join. I'm Natalie Leonard, for those who I didn't meet earlier in the opening session today, and you all are here for a awesome workshop called Production Studies Perspectives on Remaking Studio. We'll do some introductions in a moment. To start, I just want to pull up our Zoom etiquette and guidelines real quick again, so I'll share that, and then we can get started with the session. So I'm going to share a screen here. We do ask that if everyone's able, please have your video on for the session today. We do encourage you to take care of yourself, eat breaks, don't do that. Take a break to eat, drink some beverages, and get a quick kind of step away. If you do step away, please turn off your video. The other thing we'll ask is that you add your pronouns as part of your Zoom name. So to do that, there's some instructions here on the right of the screen. So you'll click the participant button to open your participant panel, and then find your own name in that participant list. Click on the More button next to your name, and then you can adjust your name to add pronouns that you like and prefer into your name here on Zoom. We'll just ask you all to respect whoever's speaking, and we're going to try to keep chat to everybody to a minimum. And please mute your microphone when you aren't speaking today. And we will use a system called Progressive Stack. So to help facilitate discussions later today, we will ask you to type the word stack, S-T-A-C-K, in the chat. And Jessica and myself will help kind of moderate, and we'll be able to call on folks in order of people who have voiced stack in the chat. So we'll try that for today. Just to note that all of these workshops are being recorded, so you consent to being recorded by being here today. They will be shared with other folks who've registered for the ABC School. And if you have any questions about that, you can send us an email. If you want, you can turn your video off for the purposes of privacy. You can also adjust your name using the method we just talked about if you'd like to change your name. But otherwise, that information and the workshop today will be recorded. And then some quick discussion guidelines. So please acknowledge, use, and respect people's pronouns that they share. When you're talking, please try to use I statements. So don't assume that you're speaking for others or have the same opinions necessarily as others. Please try to listen to what others are saying, and assume good faith and positive intent in what other folks are sharing today. Again, respect the spirit of the progressive stack. We'll try to kind of organize the discussion using that method. We'll respect the agenda today and folks' time, so we will try to end right at 5 today. And democracy and organizing is messy, and so if today's a little bit crazy, it's okay. We'll still have a good time. So that's that with the logistics. I want to welcome Laura Malati, Mariana Mora, Silke Kapp, Will Thompson, and Giovanna Martino, who are all helping host and facilitate this session today. We're really excited to have you. Will, I may turn to you and let you, kind of lead the introductions here of folks, or if each of you want to take your turn to introduce yourself, that's fine too. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Will, first.
Great, thank you very much, Natalie. Let me see, sorry, I'm balancing two screens in a screen. I will, sorry. So the session, the facilitators for this part of the group team, this session's group of facilitators are part of a core team of a new Brazil-UK group called TFTK, Translating Pharaoh, Transforming Knowledges of Architecture, Design, and Labor, a project with some 24 research collaborators working together to develop a new transdisciplinary field of production studies, starting with the translation and study of texts from Brazilian architect and theorist Sergio Ferro, more of which you'll hear about in a minute. And I'll introduce myself. I'm an American anthropologist. I research construction labor in China, and I've taught at the University of Michigan and now part of the TFTK Production Studies Project based in Newcastle University in the UK. Laura Malati is a master in architecture and urban planning from the University of Sao Paulo, and she began in 2020 also working on the TFTK project. Mariana Mora, wave when you when I've said your name, if you would, is an architect and urban researcher interested in self-construction processes and informality in the perspective of global South. She has taught architecture at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and is one of the postdoctoral researchers, as am I, on the TFTK team, working along with Professor Silke Kapp in the translation process of Sergio Ferro's work. Silke Kapp is an architect and PhD in philosophy, a professor of design and critical theory at the School of Architecture of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. As one of the international co-eyes of the TFTK project, she leads the team that's translating Sergio Ferro's theoretical work. Giovanna Martino is graduated from the University of Campinas, works at UCINA, CTAH, a technical advisory for architecture and urbanism that technically and politically advises social movements. She joined the project recently in early 2022. So, hello, and nice to meet you all. We'll be breaking out into breakout rooms later to be able to have more intimate conversations. But we're going to start with a few words about production studies and Sergio Ferro. If you may have seen this, I don't know if everyone was able to access the PDF, but you'll hear more about it from Silke in a minute, but do find that on the resources link on the Luma. It is a small piece, we think very accessible, of Sergio Ferro's work that really introduces some of the key concepts that of his political critique of architecture. So let me hand it over now to Silke to say some words about Ferro, if I can, to introduce, and then I'll come back and give a really brief introduction to what we mean by production studies. Silke, thank you.
Thanks, Will. Hi, everybody. So good to be here. And thank you very much, Peggy, and everyone who is organizing this amazing event. So let me just say some words about Sérgio Ferro, who is well known in Brazil and also in France, but not so much for the English-speaking public. He was born in 1938 in Brazil, studied architecture at the University of São Paulo in the 50s. And when Brazil's new modernist capital, Brasília, was under construction, Sérgio already started a professional career, designing entire buildings for Brasília even before graduating. The whole construction industry in the country was kind of booming, and architects saw themselves as heroes of a new national era with a kind of social task of providing better cities, housing, public facilities, and everything else. But after experiencing these construction sites in Brasília, Sérgio, he started to question the whole modernist project and its ideology. And around this same time, he also began to study Marx's Capital in an interdisciplinary reading group of some of the leading intellectuals in São Paulo. And he kind of shifted his focus from the sphere which the economists usually call distribution to the sphere of production. So instead of understanding poverty and social inequality and all the rest of it as a consequence of unjust distribution of social wealth, he questioned how and under which conditions architecture was being produced. This meant a critique not of design products and their shortcomings or their qualities, but of architectural design as a means of organizing construction according to capitalist commodity production. So let's take an example. You may imagine the most carefully designed housing project, and even if such a project offers its future inhabitants a relatively good standard of living, which is often not the case, as we well know, but building this kind of development under conventional relations of production still involves a lot of unpleasant, poorly paid, and socially despised labor. So paradoxically, the very inequalities that the design, with the best of intentions, tries to remedy on one side, I mean, the side of consumption or use, if you want, these inequalities are reproduced on the other side, the side of production. There is a video talk that Sergio gave at Central San Martin's earlier this year. I think we have the link in the material we provided. And there he explains this shift in his own terms. Watch it or watch it again. It may be useful. So in the early 60s, Sergio and two of his friends, Rodrigo Lefebvre and Flávio Império, they formed a group later called Arquitetura Nova and began some experiments to change the relations of production in their building sites. So they managed to build some houses for relatively wealthy friends, making a lot of mistakes, he himself says it, but also achieving some remarkable results, even in this organization of labor on the building site and how they interacted with people and so on. Meanwhile, Ferro got a position as a lecturer of architectural history at the same University of São Paulo, and he kept kind of working on his theoretical approach, trying to understand these inequalities on the building site. However, in 1964, the Brazilian state was taken over by a military coup, which step by step destroyed the country's democratic structures and led to a dictatorship. Ferro then joined the armed struggle against the regime and was imprisoned for a year around 1970. And he then fled to France, where he still lives today. He became a professor at the University of Grenoble, where he founded the Deschamps-Chantier laboratory and developed a significant body of theoretical and historical research, some of which was published in France and in Brazil, but never translated to English. And in a way, Marxian approaches had got out of fashion in the late 20th century. So I think that's probably the reason. This text from Strasbourg to Paris, which we have suggested as a preparation for today, is part of this research of a history of architecture seen from the building site. It kind of explains, and Sergio does the same thing in a much more detailed way in other works, but he explains how architectural design came into the position that we now understand as normal or even as natural. What the TFTK project is trying to do now is to reopen and expand this debate around architecture in capitalism, its implications, and possibly its subversions or alternatives. This does not mean, it has never meant following Ferro's theory like a dogma. He does not nurture this kind of approach in any way. It's quite the opposite. So what we intend to do is a starting point for this field of production studies to expand the critical theory of architecture, in particular with the framework of a critique of political economy, and to foster and bring together experimental practices against capitalism, basically, or even in its possibilities of escape sometimes. So we have reading groups in English and Portuguese every month, kind of following the translations that we are doing. Don't worry, I'm not the translator. I'm just the leading person of the translating team. But we have wonderful translators. Mari is part of the team, and also Ellen Hayward and Anna Souza. So if you are interested in this debate and also in debating these translations, you are very welcome to join us in these reading groups. Just let us know and we will send you the information. Okay, Will, you again. Thanks very much.
Thanks, okay. So I'll start with a few words on production studies, and then after that, each of us will present very briefly an example of how we've tried to bring this focus on labor processes involved in making into studio teaching. Again, so TFTK is this 3.5-year research project with some 24 affiliated researchers in Brazil, Great Britain, Europe, and the US, along with a core team and advisory board, including Peggy Deemer, who has been really a great asset helping us guide our mission and supporting this emerging perspective around production and bringing it to the discipline of architecture. So what is production studies, and why do we believe that there's a need for this field of research in architecture and design? And one caveat to all this is this is a bit idiosyncratic and condensed version of production studies for the purposes of this session. It's a concept that's still emerging and evolving, but I think it's useful to have a clear articulation as a place to begin for the discussions that we're going to have today. So a main thrust of what's emerging is the production studies approach involves a shift from focusing on design and reception of the architectural product towards the relations of design, to construction labor in particular, but also beyond that to the long processes and histories of materials and making that architecture relies upon, but which often don't count as architecture's main concerns. So starting from that point, production studies then tries to understand the implications for architecture's dominant theories and practices. And then also to extend the same critique to other kinds of design disciplines situated at the boundaries of material and mental and material production. So a production studies project may look at any moment on the production process, design, construction, consumption, or use of space. But I think what makes it different, or what we're trying to do, is to look at it in relation to all the other moments of production. In this sense, production studies endeavors to be long, broad, and deep. Long in that understanding any moment of production in its historical context, broad in understanding a moment of production in relationship to other points on the continuum of production processes, things that are the prefabrication, the mining, at any point of production. And deep recognizes the process of material making that has outputs that are not only material or technical, but also result in a range of outcomes at multiple levels. So they have the material and the technical. They also have the creation and circulation of political economic value. At another level, they involve the formation and organization of social life. They give resources for the creation of cultural meanings, narratives, and public symbolic resources. And they feed our production of knowledge, collective, explicit theorization, systemization, and education around design and production. And so what we try to do is to look at not only what the construction site may do for the production of the building, but also what it does in the production of society, culture, and our own theories of architecture. Another way of thinking about production studies is an account of the externalities of architecture, the things that are produced but not usually taken into consideration. So while architecture is not as totalizing or reductive as economics, using externalizing points to the things that are made but not usually thought of as part of architectural knowledge, or at least not centered by architecture research and discourse, and we believe, I think, in many studios. So I hope that gives some overall guide to thinking about how production studies, and something to talk about in our upcoming breakout rooms. And now, to give a more concrete sense of what it means in studio, I'll hand it over to Laura, who will now introduce some very short presentations on our own studio experiences that have tried to put some of this into practice in the classroom. Thank you. Laura?
Okay, thank you. I will try to screen share. So let me check. I thought I was going like third, and then it said Laura, and I was like, oh, so sorry. Okay. So I'll just screen share the window. So let's see if it works. Can you see it already? Okay, so I'll talk briefly. I'll try to be really.
Oh, sorry. No. Oh, sorry.
That's why.
So that's why. But no.
Confusing.
Okay. As they said, organizing is messy. Sorry about that. No, Laura. I was just going to say that you would. I had thought you were going to say
introduce
something
the
about the
whole
breakout rooms, but
presentations. I thought
No,
I was
no.
going to do this later.
Ah.
Okay.
okay.
Go ahead, Lara.
Yeah,
You have-
since
Go ahead.
I'm already
Sorry.
here, so
Yeah, I should have made it. That was our plan all along.
it's
Thanks.
okay. The messy part, we found it. So I'm going to talk about this first experience. Then it's not actually a studio experience. It's a broader project. So it's called Architecture and Urban Planning Model Offices. In Portuguese, it would be, the acronym would be EMAU, for Escritórios Modelos de Arquitetura e Urbanismo. And the general idea here is to talk a little bit about harnessing student idealism and realism. So this was part of my master's research that I concluded in 2021, but it was developed between 2017 and 2020, basically. So I'll try to present really briefly the scenario when this project starts. It is a project that it's led by students. So it's not like something that maybe, I don't know, teachers come and propose to students, but it actually came from these meetings that they have yearly from architecture and urban planning students. And I'll just give a brief idea of the scenario in the 90s, since I think most people here is not from Brazil, so they won't know what was happening then. So basically, economy, politics, education. So we had the lost decade inheritance after 22 years of dictatorship. And I don't know if you know about this, but US has something to do with this. And a lot of Latin America countries went through the same in the 60s. So ours was from 64 to 88. And we had at the time high unemployment rates. So it leads to increase in social inequalities and urban peripheries. There was a lack of national housing policies that we had one until 86, I don't know, but we didn't have at the time a national one. We had an expansion of the higher education private sector, which leads to, among other factors, to mercantilization of education with lack of scientific critical thinking and outreach, because it's not really profitable when you are selling education. So besides that, despite all that, we had also major advances in democratic discourse. We had a new constitution, for instance, recognition of real city and the social role of the architect, debates around Freudian outreach activities. I hope everybody here understands when I'm talking about Paulo Freire, but if anyone never heard about him, you can just say something later in the chat, I don't know. And also we had institutionalization of ATIS, that is our acronym for Technical Assistance for Social Housing. And we also had at the time a search for approximation between academic universe and society's demands. So in this scenario, it was formulated the genetic code for this project, this outreach project called EMAU. So basically, the idea is to have an interdisciplinary action that goes beyond the walls of the university to meet the communities and social movements with the active participation of students throughout this process. This action intended more than the union between theory and practice and the approximation between academic and professional worlds, the construction of a critical and conscious perception of the student, which would be acquired through his immersion in a participative and dialogical process of architectural practice, generating, therefore, a new way of acting for this professional towards the social reality. So all this, I'll give now some examples of how this new way of acting would look like on the past 30 years, give or take. So just some examples. And so the main idea of the EMAU is to be this really broad bridge between the university and marginalized communities that are, in this case, marginalized. It means that are on the margin of the society. So how they would do this could be through workshops. So sometimes they will have workshops for students or also for communities, or all of this together, trying to aim for alternative building techniques. So we have earth, bamboo, wood pallets, worn tires, so things like that are not going actually to the mainstream market for architecture. The technical advisory that's related to these ATIS that I commented before. So it's basically, really basically, work together with these marginalized communities. And inside the university, they could work through elective disciplines, like so connecting these outreach activities to the university program, and also through events. So promote debates inside and outside academia and inside their own community. So bring some of the university to the outside and some of the outside the community to the university through different kinds of events. So student events or even grad students, professors, or movements, social movements, events, etc. So all of these are crossed by the alternative ways of relation that the internal structure of the MAU tries to apply. So a horizontal, a dialogical, autonomous, self-managed, transdisciplinary, participatory, and etc. This kind of different relations that we usually don't see in a traditional office, the professional market, for example. So some examples, this is CENEMAU in 2019. CENEMAU is like this yearly seminar that the EMAUs have, this national seminar they have yearly since, I don't know, I think 2007 or something like that. So that's a way to keep in touch with other EMAUs around the country, to exchange experiences, to build the discourse and the debate around architecture, not only the education, but also practice. So this was an MTST settlement. This is the landless movement of rural landless movement in Brazil. And this was in Minas Gerais state, from the same state Silk and Mari are from. Those two, the left one is Rio de Janeiro in 2014, and the right one is another CENEMAU in the same CENEMAU in 2019. So those are different situations. The first one was this earth workshop where they were building this space for with the community and for this community. And here we have like different kind of actions. So on the left we have some of the team, the team was there to press this kind of advisory, but it's not the best word, but advisory for the community. And on the right side is the plenary. So they were, a lot of our work, we know how it goes. It's a lot of debate. So this is an example of an open debate on this seminar. And this is a workshop also in a settlement in Brasilia. This is the new capital that Silke was talking about, where Sergio worked when he was young. And this is a workshop for earth-based band. So it's another example of ways of doing architecture, not only through design. And here we have outreach activity that this is a kind of more structured one. They had like a grant, so they had some money to use and to do this kind of workshops and these activities with the communities. So this was a program that was from 2012 to 2016 on this community in Salvador, Bahia. And it's a different approach with the models. And this, I think this is the last one, is another one from a seminar in 2010. And this was an intervention that one of three that they had on this seminar, on this community, or actually this is a region with 8 big communities in Vitória, Espírito Santo. And so basically just to show how they are spread throughout the country. So this is from 2016. At the time we had around 36, I think 30 something EMAUs active. Here we have the mapping of some that were not active anymore or were still being created. So just to give you a general idea of how they are spread throughout the territory. So basically, on my research, I interviewed many of them, many of the participants, ex-participants and professors, advisors, etc. And I could raise some of the main difficulties they had and some of the most impacts they had on the education. So on the difficulties side, of course, lack of funding and institutional recognition. The self-management is something really nice, but it's really hard to do if you try it. Student productivity and discontinuities, that's something that also comes with the self-management. The participatory methodology is super fun, but it's also super hard. Frictions with the professional market. There was this time when professionals were trying to stop ML's activities, saying that they would invade their market, which is not true because they try to work with these marginalized communities, so they don't have access to the professional market for a number of reasons. And finally, this articulation with other actors like the university and public power. So this, in general, will show actually the fragilities of the educational system itself. And on the other side, with the impacts in the education, we have the awareness that we bring not only for the students, but also for the communities participating and all the other people involved, related to social, political process and product design, the right to the city and the decent housing. Methodology, again, the participatory is also here because it's something good too. So the dialogical and this kind of contact with excluded communities. For the professional to bring this awareness of their political and social impact, the eternal elitism of the profession. I think it's the same around the world. And the existence of the arts, because it's something that usually is not brought to the table during our undergrad studies. And finally, for the university, you have the social return of the extension, in this case of the outreach. Student protagonism, that's something that's not really common sometimes, and democratization of knowledge, because it's exchange of knowledge. So the students will bring this kind of academic knowledge to the community, but they will also learn a lot with the community. So this brings to the renewal of practice and methods. That it's something that I think we are aiming here. And so to finish that, just a reflection, a general reflection about education. So the organization of education through schools and the definition of its content have always been closely linked to the socialization of the individual for labor, following the prevailing political and economic bias. And the debate around the social quality of this education implies recognizing its inscription in the demands of society, which naturally vary through time. So just to articulate those three layers of politics, education, and labor. And from these, I just brought some general questionings straight linked to this last phrase. So based on that, how could we organize architects and urban planners education in a different way? What are the contents that should be addressed? What kind of labor we want to socialize these individuals for? How would these proposals interact with prevailing political and economic bias, and how to promote continuous debates around social quality of education, recognizing the current demands of society, and do we want those demands to change? And I think that's it. I don't know if I reached the 7 minutes. Thank you.
Excellent.
Oh, that was fast, sorry.
That was great. Thanks, Laura. That's really exciting. Sorry, I'm probably the worst person to tell who to go next based on past experience. So was it Silke?
I think it's Silke.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, people, I have some images, but I think I can show them in the breakout room if you want to see them. It's just it's a little story I want to tell. I'm a design teacher, or I teach in this studio environment. So, and this story is from the time of the pandemic and online teaching, which was very difficult, I think, in this design context. So I would like to start with a response Ferhu gave me to a question that I asked him. And this question was, if it's even possible nowadays to shift from a design for the building site, commanding the building site, to a design from the building site, coming from the building site and done by people at the building site, as it used to be a long time ago, before capitalism, before architects and all the rest of it. So the question was, could we start with a rough definition of what will be built and then develop it during the work, so that building workers would no longer be just people executing a predefined product, but the product would come out of the process, just as, for instance, a piece of painting or a piece of music or whatever. is it even possible to avoid this division of labor into intellectual and material labor? Should we just stop designing? And what about construction workers who are just used to follow designs, follow orders, and are not willing to engage in any creative thinking or any whatever organization, just messy always? So, and then as an answer, Ferro told me about the process that he used when he was building his own house. I have to say, when we build our own houses, when we have the opportunity to do so, obviously we are a bit freer than in working for other people. So what he did, as he told me, he first produced lots and lots of drawings. He designed everything, not only the final product that he imagined, but also each and every technical solution and the way he could imagine that it would be done. So he kind of designed the whole process or thought it out, every detail. But then when it came to the construction side, he did not simply impose these solutions on the building team. His idea was to share the general design with this building team so that everyone would be aware of the expected result. And he also explained them that this could be changed during the process if they all together decided so. And then step by step, they discussed the technical and operational strategies together. And Ferro himself, he would only show the specific solutions that he had imagined before if he felt that they could be useful for the discussion. According to his account, they were actually applied only a few times, while on many other occasions, the building team came along with easier and smarter solutions than those he had imagined and drawn before. The end result was kind of similar, but not identical to his previous design. So, as I said, this kind of procedure is probably impossible at a conventional building site, but it may be possible if we are building for ourselves or if we are in some extraordinary circumstance, if it's an informal building site or something like this. And it's certainly possible as an academic exercise. And this was exactly what I proposed for a studio during the pandemic. When teaching architectural design, I usually work with communities using collaborative practices and trying to approach design not as an individual work of art, but rather as interfaces for people to interact with and to change over time and so on. But this obviously demands real interaction with potential users, rarely with potential builders, except when the users are self-builders. But in the pandemic, this was impossible. Interacting with real communities. And that's why I took this opportunity to propose a design exercise focused on production and not on functions and forms or any other effects that designs may have on their real or imaginary users. So it was like turning the logic upside down. The students were asked to take forms and functions more or less for granted, just as we usually do with construction and especially with relations of production on construction sites. And they should put all their energy in trying to understand the building process in technical and in social terms. And they should draw whatever they imagined as a device for discussion, not as a mandatory procedure. Now, you may think that in normal, usual design process, we do not entirely ignore materials, supporting structures and the like. But the point here is that we operate on an imaginary building site, as Sergio calls it. a site which we take, I mean, it's imaginary, but we think it's real. We take it for the real thing. We think of volumes or construction elements put on top of each other. And we think of construction often as it were a kind of toy. And we imagine that something that is easy to describe or easy to draw is also easily done. And it's not. The building site of our imagination is not real, just as the users of modern architects or the users modern architects imagine for their idealized cities or housing projects were not real. So it's a kind of, yeah, imaginary or idealized building site, which we usually have in mind when designing. So this studio called Designing from the Construction Site should actually be called Designing from the Imaginary Construction Site. And the difference is, or the point was, to draw a construction process being aware of the fact that it was just imaginary. So all the considerations, all the thinking, all the drawings, all the ideas made in this way were meant as tools for discussion with a possible construction team and nothing more. So the drawings had to be easy to understand, and the processes they represented had to be carefully thought out so that students, they would research how things are done and everything. And that was it. And it was funny because I think that even the spatial, or if you want functional result, we did very simple things, housing, some houses, a restaurant or whatever. It didn't matter, but it was on real sites. And I think that even the space itself or the kind of formal thing came out better than usual. And I can show you some of these drawings. They are not meant to be incredibly beautiful. They are meant to be incredibly clear about construction. And that was basically it. And I think it was a very interesting exercise in contrast to what we usually do, or what I and most of my colleagues usually do when thinking a lot about functions and effects and users and participation of users and so on. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Mari, are you up?
Yes.
Thank you.
I let me share my screen. Okay, wait. Let me see if this will work. Can you see the presentation? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, okay, I would start first saying that I'm really excited to be here today. So, thanks a lot, Peggy, and then Natalie, in the name of the whole ABC team, for putting this whole thing together and for having us. Unlike Silky, I will rely on a lot of very romanticized images for my presentation, so bear with me. What I will be presenting here today is some of the outcomes of a workshop which happened in the end of 2017 in a housing occupation here in Belo Horizonte called Ocupação Rosa Leão. And this was a woman-only self-construction workshop, which was organized by a feminist collective within the university with funds received from a student outreach initiative. And it reunited dwellers from different housing occupations with a few graduate and undergraduate students of the architectural school. And the whole workshop was done under the supervision of a female master builder for a period of around 2 months. So this was truly like a woman, like exclusively experience. So although this was not really like a traditional studio experience, the reason I thought of bringing it up today is because I think it can give us some ways of thinking and talking about what it is that we can learn when we are learning how to actually build a real building with, with the builders themselves. So I should also note that this was the first experience with real construction for most of the students involved, although the same was not true for most of the community participants in this workshop. Just to give a few information about the context in which this workshop took place. As I mentioned before, Rosa Leão, which was established in 2013, is one of the largest housing occupations here in our metropolitan region in Belo Horizonte. And as it happens in many other occupations, most of its dwellers are women. Most of its dwellers are Black women. So the purpose of the workshop was for us to construct a new community center that was planned for Rosa Leão in a very strategic plot in the occupation. This is the site of the plot at the beginning of the occupation, so it was sort of a central area. And the construction was a necessity that was long identified by the dwellers of Rosa Leão. And as such, it was important that it got started somehow. In cases like these, in urban occupations, collective buildings are usually done by the own communities in rounds of multirões or in self-construction task forces. And it is not rare that the most politically active dwellers or the social movements involved with these occupations seek out the university for help with the so-called technical decisions. So the community had actually already gone through a long period of discussions with another research group to come up with a design for the community center, which they called ZOCA, Occupied Zone for Culture and Art. And the construction was already planned out and they had material, like resources for it, but the people, mostly men, who had committed to the task of building it in several occasions for very valid reasons, failed to get it off the ground. So this was something that the community was really looking forward to build, and they could not really get started. And then women, on the other hand, apparently lacked the necessary abilities to get it done on their own, although they were the ones most actively engaged in the planning processes and in wishing that the community center did materialize. This is often also the case in spaces with such contrasting sexual division of labor, since women in these situations are the ones relying mostly on the uses of these collective spaces. So in that context, the proposal of the workshop started out as a way to give them more autonomy to carry out these and other common building projects that they had planned for their communities, or even ideas that they would have for their own houses. But of course, like any other real life experience, the process was somehow contradictory. It raised a lot of questions we hadn't thought of before, and also disconstructed a few of our preconceptions from both the place and the social relations that self-construction in a peripheral space involves. So what I will do here is bring two topics that sort of relate to the outcomes of this experience based on a few specific situations we went through, just so we have maybe a broader perspective for discussion on the role of architectural design and how can we shift its focus to production. So the first topic is in direct relation to drawing. Oh, I so forgot to go on the pictures. Sorry, happens. So the first topic is in direct relation to drawing, not the design as a whole, but the representation of ideas in a drawing and how can we approach it in new ways, considering that it usually works as a sort of power knowledge device. As I mentioned before, when we organized the construction workshop, there was already a design made for the community center. And the original idea was for us to just execute that project in place. I think, the design process which happened before was very inclusive as well and collectively made. But even in this case, when we started, we could notice there was a clear rupture between those making decisions in a user perspective and then those who were to build based on such decisions. And it was not a rupture directly related to the subjects per se, because a lot of those moments that we're now constructing were also involved in the design phase, but it had a lot to do with the importance given to the drawing, or with the importance that design received in that moment. So in one side, architectural students that could read the drawings and could imagine how to build, how the building should look like, even though they could not imagine how to even start to actually build it. And then on the other side, women which had reasonable knowledge of how building was actually done, although they were also very insecure and unsure of their ability to do it. And even more so when faced with a drawing that was a sort of instruction sheet that they could not read. So in that case, for the workshop, we saw that drawing was in itself a sort of power device, because although each of these distinct groups had shortcomings when it came to actually building, the initial interactions made it clear that the students were somewhat perceived as the ones capable of making design decisions on site. This was the situation we experienced, for instance, when the master builder would come for us, for the students, looking for permission to change some of the original project instructions, even though we had like zero involvement with the design phase whatsoever. So there was a sort of heritage or inherited authorship just because we were also architects or architects into being. So how can we, the thing that I wanted to bring up is how can design be used then not as the dividing point, but as the point of convergence between architects and buildings, in the same way that we try so hard to do it in relation to the consumers. If we consider like putting aside the very own separation between design and construction that we mentioned in the beginning and that evolves the whole production studies, there is a lot that we can discuss when we think of how much we invest in making drawings and images as realistic as possible so that the final consumer can actually understand it, but that the same care is not taken for the production process. So how is it that in this case, we can sort of reach that knowledge hierarchy in place that mandates that there is one who knows the code and makes the code, which is the architect, and then another one that should just find its way around decodifying it or reading it, which is the builder. So the second topic relates to how we account for gender in the broader debate of the production studies, or to put it in another way, what specificities gender divisions bring to the social relations of production in the building site, and what does teaching or have to do with all of it, like following the idea, and this can be sort of following the idea of design as a technical knowledge. So in our workshop, each participant received a certificate in the end. And when we thought about the certificate, it was mostly to ensure that those who were interested in working with civil construction could somehow, in that piece of paper, have a proof of ability, that it could count as a good starting point in an overly sexist labor market. But in our conversations, we could see that the paper seemed to matter very little to those who had professional intention. And they seem to matter a lot more for, because of course, like women, those who wanted to pursue a career in construction, in civil construction, had other professional training courses that they could, that had more meaning, that had more value, of course. But on the other hand, some women did mention that the certificate would help them level the discussions about construction and renovations in their own houses. So it seemed like they could benefit from an outside certification of their ability to decide about their own living spaces. This is a subtle, like, gender relation of power, and others not so subtle were often observed during our time in this workshop, from things as small as our meeting times having to be until a certain hour so that the woman could go back home to make lunch for the entire family. But what matters here for the discussion, I think, is that this gender aspect is closely intertwined with the distinction between a professional technical knowledge and a popular everyday knowledge. So for most of the women involved in the course, which already knew a lot about construction, or which already had a few of the basic construction techniques, technical knowledge was something unattainable, and it was also a barrier. They had learned how to construct, or they had learned the ideas about construction by working in their own houses, by helping their partners or helping their fathers or helping their neighbors. But often in these cases, these people, these men, they were often involved in civil construction labor market. So formal theoretical and technical knowledge acquired in the university or as a professional skill was embedded with a sort of valorization that is never to be questioned, while these women's daily life experiences and competencies depended a lot more of a sort of an external legitimacy. And that was what the workshop was somehow providing them. Having a teacher that would confirm their construction knowledge, authorize them to express ideas and question decisions inside their own houses, something that before they would probably refrain from doing. And at the same time, the building itself proved to themselves their ability and their autonomy to make decisions for the community and to carry on important building tasks as the ones that they were doing there. So one last thing that I think is not necessarily design related, but nevertheless, I think it's a crucial point to be mentioned, is that of the material conditions on which these sort of counter-hegemonic experiences take place, especially in the context, of course, of the global South. I think this is also a very relevant topic of discussion when we were thinking about architecture beyond capitalism. The experience with the workshop, like many other self-construction experiences here in Brazil, often leads us to reflect on the limits of these practices as emancipatory processes, or even like as practices with any revolutionary content. From one side, self-construction is often criticized because of its role as a capital strategy for lowering wages, and also as a mechanism for urban spoliation. These aspects of exploitation, of course, cannot be overlooked. But on the other hand, and as Sérgio Ferro ponders, mentions, at some extent, self-construction, and especially in this task force modality, can trigger a process of politicization from the reunion towards constructing, and thus influence some sort of class consciousness, especially when combined with self-organization processes. In the context of the self-construction woman-only workshop, we were faced with the duality of seeing in this experience an opportunity for women to exchange impressions and to align strategies for their communal spaces in the occupations, and with that also to benefit from this empowered protagonism in which could probably be replicated in other aspects of everyday life, hopefully, while at the same time we could not overlook the fact that this was yet another task that was asked of women to take in the name of the collectivity, in contexts in which the reproduction work is already an overloaded burden endeavor. So just to wrap it up, I'm wondering if construction in practice can bring up so many different questions, then what should be the role of design, if any at all, in all of this? Okay, there's a delay so much in the pictures. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'll share my screen. I'm going to talk very quickly about, can you see? Yes, great. Sorry, again, the screen problem. Sorry. So I will talk very briefly about a course I'm currently co-teaching with Katie Lloyd-Thomas, who's here, who's the UK side primary investigator for the TFTK project research grant. Our course is called Design Oversight. It's a year-long class for master's students at Newcastle in what's called a linked research module, meaning that students engage with a single topic over the course of a year. And while not offered as a design studio per se, the linked research format is studio-like, organized with students working closely together and with us as instructors on a shared thematic and problem, and with collaborative, broadly defined open-ended outputs that allow for emerging redefinitions of the goals as the work goes ahead. The title, Design Oversight, is inspired by Sergio Ferro's major work, Design Chantier, which translates roughly to design in the building site. And particularly to draw your attention to that slash, or actually it's not, I don't have a picture, but in it, it's design/chantier, design over the building site, which represents the kind of subordination of the building site and processes by design that is the political economic relation Faro critiques. So we started the linked research module with a location or specific urban form, which is the construction site hoarding. Hoarding is the very felicitous British term for construction screens and fences that surround the building site. We suggested that the hoarding is an under-acknowledged fixture of urban spaces, one that's always doing more than its technical function of protecting and marking a site. It's an active and dynamic boundary between the city and the labor that goes on beyond there. So studios often start from a non-architectural starting point, a social or environmental problem, one that, but what this does, I think, slightly differently is that instead of going on then to design a solution or a response to that problem, it stays with that problem. And what instead it's asking students to do is to not treat that question as the basis of a brief or a program to derive formal outcomes, but as an end in itself, and with the idea of critique or knowledge production as the primarily deliverable. And there's latitude in that knowledge to be expressed in design, but again, with the design feeding the knowledge or critique rather than the other way around, which is the more normal way that studios are shown. And this is, I'll just show very quickly some of the student project in the sort of halfway point that they've come up with. So we thought this was going to be an initial metaphor that we stepped out of, but the amount of interest that they've looked at have shown over the hoarding and sort of looking at it as a typology, thinking about Newcastle in particular and the way that building sites interface with the city. In this case, thinking of a project that would use the hoarding as an actual screen on which to show some of the relations behind. This, which is also kind of spectacular, is a slightly tongue-in-cheek model construction site, including a Lego hoarding that implies the necessity of putting up safety before constructing Legos. So I'll end it there only to say that I think in some ways what we did with this class is the same thing we're going to now step into and ask you to do, which is an experiment. We gave them all the sort of program of production studies in Faro and had them read, but then asked them to think, what can you do as a designer? How are you going to take this and use the capacities that you have of design and sort of deal with this critique of design's relationship? And they've come up with some spectacular things that I think are really exciting. So I'll let now Lara introduce the breakout rooms, and then we'll get to it so that we can have some, so it's not just us talking. Thanks.
Yeah, I think you can just leave your screen, sharing.
Okay,
so.
Tell me when, nod.
Yeah. So this first part of the workshop, it was more to give you a general base of the discussions that we have been doing on production studies, and also to give those examples of what we can do differently, having the process in mind, not only the product. So for the breakout rooms, we will give you like 40 minutes or something, maybe less, because we have lost a little bit of the time in the beginning, but it's really to start the conversation. We ask you to imagine, you can go, we ask you to imagine you are in a studio class, really simple. I think everybody has been into one if you are architect students or professors here. So it's just look around and think about who do you see in this studio class. So you see the professor, you see students, you see, no, come back, wait.
I'm pacing you.
Sorry. So think about who are those people. So who is the professor? He's probably just an academic, or is he has a construction background, or he could be like a bricklayer, or he could be an engineer or something like that. So what are we doing on this studio class? So probably the first thing you have in mind will be the design. That's usually what we have on the design. Like, this is the final product, and you have, I don't know, maps, or anyway, you know what where I'm going to. So for whom we are doing this, for whom we are designing, and where we are having this studio class. So usually we are in this physical space inside the university or not. You may have different experiences, but usually it's like that. So just a quick example, you can go now, Will, to the next one. Just a quick example of a traditional classroom. So we have the professor in the front, the board with the content that he's teaching, and we have students in a grid format or something like that. An example of studio, at least a regular type of studio that we have here, is this kind of, you have the tables with the students around, they are divided in groups, and the professor goes from one to another, and the content is usually in the table in each group. So next one, please.
Sorry. No.
Yeah, so where is the construction work? That's, I think, like, just to put it really in simple terms, on when you look around, where is the construction? Where's the construction work? So next one. So the general idea that the general question we want you to reflect on during the breakout rooms is I think I lost a word there, but in which ways a studio can be organized to take construction and the social realities of construction work into account. So this is the main idea. I will put the PDF with all these final slides for you in the chat so you can download it. Don't worry about taking notes right now. So next and last one. This is just an example of an alternative proposal. So when you think about the who, the when, the where, the what, the where, and for whom. So this is just an example of a participative building site with participative design. So we have professor, but we also have technicians and residents, future residents, or nowadays residents. And we also have students, so they are all mixed together, and the content can be on the design itself, but also on the building site. And the movement is a little bit different. So people go from design to building site and vice versa, and etc. So this is just an example of how things could be made differently. So how the studio could be differently organized. And that's it. The last slide, Will, your turn. So that's just the general idea. So we'll try to break the rooms. I don't know how many we are. 26 people prevailed here. Yes, so survived it so far. I think we can have 5 groups or 4, something like that. So we can have 4 or 5 people inside each breakout.
And I think
so
Natalie is going to just assign them randomly. So
and try to split us into them.
Yes. So you all be randomly assigned into 5 different rooms, and we'll each have 4 to 5 folks in these rooms.
Perfect.
One last thing, like inside the breakout rooms, you can discuss between people there and decide which way you can like register this. You can just send in the chat and then someone just copy all of that. You can use a mirror board from your own. You can use a Google Docs or whatever. So whatever you feel more comfortable, just to have it registered so we can come back later and just give a general idea of what you thought about. That's it.
All right, you all will be assigned. So I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms, and then we'll meet back here in about 30 minutes, a little bit less, for group discussion at the end.
Perfect. Thanks, Natalie.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everyone. Welcome back.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for all of you who've stuck with us. Laura, do you want to take over introducing the breakout, or I think I don't know how much anyone got. It seems shorter than we imagined it, and it always does, because conversations get interesting very quickly. But I don't know if anyone wants to. Laura, do you have a particular program for this part, or do you want to just open it up to hear from some representative ideas from the groups?
I actually can't talk right now. There's another meeting right next to me, so I can't.
Oh, okay.
Use my mouth.
No worries. Okay. I'll let you be quiet then.
Megan, you could tell them a bit about our talk.
Please.
Yeah, we had a very interesting beginning of a talk. And yeah, it did feel short, but I think we talked a little bit about you know, the answer in the US and the UK and other places has been something called a design build studio or live projects in the UK. And thinking about, you know, what are those covering, how are they being presented from different people's perspectives of who've taken them or who have had them at their universities, and then what are they not covering, which is, you know, labor, which is, you know, the construction process in many cases, you know, and I think everyone's had kind of slightly different experiences, but just thinking about, you know, that is a type of studio that has really been embedded in many university programs, and thinking about that as a site of, as one possible site for action and for change and for providing kind of a different theoretical framework or just approach to that that could be adopted, than one that takes into consideration, you know, labor and who is doing the production on building sites. And, you know, from my perspective, quickly, you know, I'm in San Diego, California, which is across the border, you know, what, 30 minutes away from here is Tijuana. And most of the labor, a lot of the labor that is done on building sites is either, you know, related to the border. And so there is this racial and social class aspect to it, that we have plenty of students who come into our program who have grown up in that, either their parents were builders or are builders, or they were, and they don't see a value in that, and they're actually in architecture to kind of to go the next into a professional class beyond that. And I think engaging with that more critically, at least in our current context, is extremely important if we're going to move forward.
We can open up the Slack for this as well, if that will help this. So type Slack in the chat and we can help moderate this discussion. And something I'll pose to the group, you know, we're with what you all saw and talked about today, you know, thinking through what's next for my institution or my, you know, workforce, or right, like thinking about that kind of anything like tangible methods or things like that, you know, it'd be interesting to talk, I think, take it that direction. I'm curious about, you know, because Megan, I'm familiar with design build. So, but in other countries, is there kind of a related equivalent to the design build process here in the United States?
I was saying in New Zealand, the health and safety regulations got so extreme that it was basically impossible to get students onto a building site, even just to visit. And so the design build studio has completely disappeared and has largely been replaced by public art projects, which I think are kind of a completely different beast, and can be kind of problematic. So.
And Laura's mentioning in the chat, they have something called, I'm gonna butcher this, Canteiro Escola, school building site, similar in some points to design build.
And in fact, that came up in our conversation as well, that there's so many obstacles to institutional obstacles, I think, to bringing students onto building sites, letting students handle tools. At some point, the sort of liability and the coffering of students is sometimes very intense, that prevents studio from being opened up in this way, which itself probably has, you know, an ideology behind it and an effect on the types of architects it creates.
You know, it's so incredibly difficult to arrange this situation where students can actually build. So if we are able to do this, it should be with a social critique together with it, with being aware of class differences, race differences, gender differences, and all the rest of it. Because if you just do it as a kind of technical experience, I think you, as Megan said before, or no, it was Fatima, I think, I'm not sure, but it's more about learning how to manage other people's labor than about overcoming capitalism, making revolution, doing things in a completely different way. So I think that those people who have this opportunity may want to engage in a more kind of critical framing of the whole thing. This would be really something great.
Yeah,
We'll
we
go
talked-
to
we talked about-
Juliana.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry, we'll start using the stack system. And Katie, if you want to type in stack next, then I'm going to go to Juliana next.
Yeah, so if the point is indeed to try to think about construction labor against capitalism, I think, I mean, I really liked the discussion at the very beginning, but I think there is a tendency to do away with the worker, right? With the skilled, waged worker of the construction site through these self-construction, design, build thing. And I think on the contrary, the architect and the designer of the project should make sure that the design is actually not cutting out or reducing or standardizing or doing away with the skilled construction work, right? So all these micro units made out of shipping containers. So in other words, unfortunately, our main way of driving housing costs down has been to squeeze out the wage of the worker, of the cost of the construction, right? And there's a good reason why construction is expensive, because it requires a lot of labor and a lot of skilled labor and people who've been trained and need safety protocols in place, right? And I think that as architects, that we should protect that. In our designs, right? We should not say, well, we're going to bring some students and we're going to build things complete, which is all very good. But if we are to think about social relations of production that are embedded in our design, devaluing the skilled work that is required to build things is not the way to go.
And Katie, did you want to speak?
Thanks. No, I think it was just one of the things that we talked about was, in a way, yeah, let's say in the design build or the live build kind of project, who is it that's doing the teaching and what kind of materials are you working with? And it's rarely the kind of person that Juliana's just referred to. So in my place, it's often artists that kind of come in and they teach making, they don't teach building. And so you almost never meet a skilled tradesperson, a skilled construction worker, a contractor, and that seemed to kind of resonate really around the group as well. And I think that ties in a lot with what Juliana's saying, actually.
And Jessica.
So maybe just to say in the answer to the who, if I'm being a good workshop participant. So then the who would also include skilled builders, experts. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a Google Doc that we were sharing, and we had a pretty good discussion around questions of, Jean was talking about preservation, adaptive reuse came up from Ronak, and I think these questions around how Production studies can also take into consideration post-production studies. I think one of the things that I'm interested in this group is that a lot of the studies also around documents of production, and for the site to change that, really a lot of the documents that also start to tailor the site. I know like Katie's here, so specifications, contracts. Architects don't really contract with subcontractors anymore. Those are the kind of documents that we've discussed as being incredibly dull, that never really not always get mined through or thought of. But I think evaluating those in a studio context and understanding how they've actually impacted the building site is something that I think that even historically contemporary is very helpful for understanding how we as architects can begin to also change those, because ultimately I think they start to impact and set up the relationships that we have on building sites. I think, yeah, getting into this assignment is really fascinating because I think the choreography of a studio is incredibly important. And we talked about what happens in an hour, a day, a week, and that's always something that is that comes to mind. So I think one of the big questions or paths that we were talking about is how to even collectivize and start to think about studio that's something beyond just the individual project of the single student trying to push forth an alibi, and to think about how the work is seated in a larger conversation. I know Jean was really pushing for something that was that might be more seminar based and built around discussion of the work. Yeah, Katie, I'm just going to address this because Katie's bringing it up right now about post-production studies. I don't have this totally fleshed out, but because preservation is a part of this, and so much of it seems what Sergio Ferro's work is about, talking about the process of building and production. We were talking about post-production being the thought of care. How would you design for maintenance afterwards, as well as to Jean's point about how would we even consider preservation from the start? And so we were dubbing that post-production studies.
I am gonna ask Tanya to talk, and then after that, we will be wrapping up. Unfortunately, we do have a 5 p.m. cutoff today for this session, but we will see you all throughout the week and have time on Saturday to talk again as a group.
I mean, some of the things that our group discussed, and I was also reminded by the fact that this idea of valuing skilled labor, maybe it's, not a coincidence that a lot of this sort of pro bono community labor, which is of course valuable on the one hand, but on the other hand, often happens through these aid projects, and it's a type of subsidy, I guess, labor subsidy of sorts in a sense. And so maybe it is not a coincidence that it happens often in these sort of international aid-related projects. And equally, there is something valuable in not monetize. I mean, there are so many social formations to do with construction, which were not all about monetizing labor. But the problem, I guess, is when we are locating that kind of a structure within a wage structure, and these obviously become totally unequal. So that is one of the challenges in a way, and maybe students we along with students can think about. These can be some of the prompts to think about, actually. And one of the things we discussed in our group was the labor hierarchy and labor organization and wage itself. Most architecture studios don't think about wage, but if we actually really thought about wages, and yeah, there were also a couple of other things, or at least one maybe I can mention, is I was remembering construction sites in India where you have a lot of sort of single male migrant labor, but you also have very poor families, when they've barely been able to get their wife and children, and they're all growing up on the construction site, usually not getting education, and very, very unsafe places. So other than the material and sort of economic relationships, social relationships, which sort of are inscribed on a site, there are these sort of wider kind of social entanglements, which are also kind of worth thinking about.
All right, we'll be wrapping here. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll hope to see your faces throughout the week. Thank you, Will and Lara
Thank you so
and
much.
Silke and Mari, and I think I'm missing one person in my thing.
Giovanna.
Giovanna, yes. Thank
And
you.
all of you.
All right.
Thanks so much. This was
Take
excellent.
care.
Take care.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you, people.